The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of Valderia Palace, where young Prince Alexander stood watching the changing of the guard. At 12 years old, he possessed an unusual quality that set him apart from other royals. He rarely spoke aloud, yet somehow everyone around him understood his wishes perfectly. Captain Marcus Thornfield, a veteran guard with 20 years of service, noticed the prince's thoughtful expression as the ceremonial parade unfolded. The boy's eyes followed every movement, every precise step, every salute. There was something different about today, though Marcus couldn't quite place what it was. Prince Alexander had been born with a condition that made speaking difficult, though his mind was sharp as any blade in the royal armory. Over the years, he had developed his own language, a combination of gentle gestures, meaningful glances, and an almost magical ability to convey his thoughts through his actions. The palace staff had learned to read his silent communications better than most people understood spoken words. King William, Alexander's father, had always worried about his son's future as a ruler. How could someone lead a kingdom without commanding words? Yet those closest to the prince knew that his silence held more power than any royal decree. When Alexander wanted something, he would simply look at a person with those deep blue eyes, tilt his head slightly, or place his hand gently on someone's arm. Somehow, his meaning always became crystal clear. On this particular morning, the royal guard was preparing for the Festival of Valor, an annual celebration where the kingdom's bravest soldiers were honored. The guards had been practicing their formations for weeks, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their movements synchronized like clockwork. Captain Thornfield took pride in leading these men, each one hand-picked for their loyalty and skill. As the practice session continued, Prince Alexander moved closer to observe. He watched as the younger guards struggled with the complex maneuvers, sweat beading on their foreheads despite the cool morning air. The veterans corrected them sharply, their voices echoing across the courtyard with military precision. The prince's attention was drawn to a particular scene unfolding near the castle gates. A new recruit, barely 18 years old, was having trouble with his formation timing. Every time he stepped out of line, Sergeant Davies would bark corrections at him, growing more frustrated with each mistake. The young guard's hands trembled as he tried to follow the commands, his face flushing with embarrassment. Alexander observed this interaction with growing concern. He had always been sensitive to the emotions of others, perhaps because his own struggle with communication had made him more aware of different ways people express themselves. He could see the fear in the young recruit's eyes, the way his shoulders tensed with each harsh word from the sergeant. Without making a sound, the prince began walking toward the training area. His footsteps were soft on the marble, but something about his approach caused the activity to gradually slow. Conversations quieted, and heads turned to acknowledge the royal presence. Captain Thornfield immediately straightened and prepared to offer the traditional greeting, but Alexander raised his hand in a gentle gesture that somehow conveyed, "Please continue as you were." The prince positioned himself where he could observe the struggling recruit more closely. The young soldier, Thomas Whitmore, was the son of a blacksmith from the outer villages. He had dreamed of serving in the royal guard since childhood, but the reality of palace life was proving more challenging than he had imagined. The precise movements required for ceremonial duties were far different from the practical skills he had learned in his father's forge. As Sergeant Davies prepared to deliver another stern correction, something unexpected happened. Prince Alexander stepped forward and placed himself directly between the sergeant and the recruit. He didn't speak, but his presence commanded immediate attention. The entire courtyard fell silent. The prince looked at Thomas with kind eyes and offered the slightest smile. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone watching, Alexander began to demonstrate the formation movement himself. Despite having no formal military training, he had observed the guards so often that he understood the basic steps. His movements were graceful rather than precise, but they clearly showed the rhythm and flow that Thomas had been missing. Thomas watched in amazement as the prince, who could have commanded him to improve or ordered him dismissed, instead chose to help him learn. Alexander repeated the movement slowly, then gestured for Thomas to try again. When the young guard attempted the formation, the prince nodded encouragingly and made a small adjustment to Thomas's stance with gentle hands. Captain Thornfield watched this interaction with growing fascination. In 20 years of military service, he had never seen a member of the royal family take such personal interest in an individual guard's training. Moreover, he had never witnessed anything quite like the prince's teaching method. Without saying a word, Alexander had communicated more effectively than hours of verbal instruction. The other guards began to gather around, drawn by curiosity and something else they couldn't quite name. There was a quality in the air, a sense of something significant happening, though none of them could have explained exactly what it was. As the morning progressed, Prince Alexander continued to work with Thomas, showing him different aspects of the ceremonial movements. But more than that, he was demonstrating something profound about leadership and compassion. Each time Thomas made progress, the prince would acknowledge it with a proud nod or a gentle pat on the shoulder. When Thomas struggled, Alexander would patiently show him again, never displaying frustration or impatience. The other guards began to notice changes in their own behavior. Sergeant Davies, who had been ready to dismiss Thomas as unfit for service, found himself offering quieter, more constructive guidance. The veteran guards started helping their newer colleagues instead of simply correcting them. The entire atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted, and it all seemed to emanate from the silent prince's gentle example. Captain Thornfield realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary. This boy, who had never spoken a command, was somehow inspiring his guards to become better versions of themselves. The military precision remained, but it was now tempered with kindness and mutual support. As the morning training session drew to a close, Prince Alexander gathered the guards around him. They formed a natural circle, drawn by his quiet magnetism. Without saying a word, he looked at each face, acknowledging their service and dedication. Then he did something that would be remembered in palace legends for generations to come. The prince removed his own royal insignia, a small golden pin bearing the family crest, and offered it to Thomas. The gesture was clear. The young guard had earned his place among them not through perfect execution, but through perseverance and the willingness to accept help and guidance. Thomas accepted the pin with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the honor and kindness shown to him. But the prince wasn't finished. He turned to Captain Thornfield and, with a series of gestures that somehow conveyed volumes, began to communicate something that would change everything. The captain watched intently as Alexander indicated the guards, then himself, then made a gesture toward the palace. His meaning gradually became clear, and Thornfield felt his breath catch in his throat. The prince was suggesting something unprecedented, something that went against centuries of royal tradition. Captain Thornfield stared at Prince Alexander, trying to fully comprehend what the boy was communicating through his expressive gestures and meaningful looks. The prince pointed to the guards, then to the common people visible beyond the palace gates, and finally placed his hand over his heart. His message was becoming clearer with each passing moment. He wanted the royal guard to serve not just the crown, but the people of the kingdom directly. The idea was revolutionary. For centuries, the royal guard had existed solely to protect the royal family and maintain palace security. They were elite soldiers, separated from common citizens by tradition, training, and social status. Yet here was the future king suggesting they should bridge that gap. Alexander continued his silent communication, his hands painting pictures in the air that spoke louder than words ever could. He gestured toward the village beyond the palace walls, then mimicked helping someone up, sharing food, building something together. The guards watched in fascination as their prince outlined a vision of service that went far beyond their current duties. Thomas Whitmore, still clutching the royal insignia, was the first to understand completely. "Your Highness," he whispered, "you want us to help the people directly, not just guard the palace?" Alexander's smile and gentle nod confirmed Thomas's interpretation. The prince then did something even more surprising. He began to walk toward the palace gates, clearly expecting the guards to follow. Captain Thornfield found himself in an unprecedented situation. The prince was leading them somewhere, but where? And what would King William say about the royal guard leaving their posts to follow his son's wordless commands? Despite his concerns, something about Alexander's quiet confidence made the captain signal for his men to follow. As they walked through the palace grounds, other members of the royal household joined the procession. Servants peered from windows, gardeners stopped their work to watch, and even some nobles emerged from their quarters to see what was happening. The sight of Prince Alexander leading the royal guard was unusual enough, but there was something in the air that suggested this was no ordinary royal walk. The group reached the main gates, where the palace guards usually maintained their ceremonial posts. Beyond the ornate iron bars, the village of Valderia stretched out in the valley below. It was market day, and the streets bustled with farmers, merchants, craftspeople, and families going about their daily lives. Alexander stopped at the gates and turned to face his unusual entourage. The guards formed a semicircle around him, still uncertain about what was expected of them. The prince looked at each face again, then placed his hands on the gate bars and looked out at the village with obvious longing. Captain Thornfield suddenly realized what the boy was feeling. Despite being born to rule these people, Alexander had spent most of his life separated from them by palace walls, protocol, and his own communication challenges. He knew his future subjects only from a distance, through reports and formal presentations. The prince wanted to know his people the way he had come to know his guards, personally, individually, with understanding and compassion. The captain approached Alexander and spoke quietly. "Your Highness, you want to go into the village?" Alexander nodded, but then made additional gestures that complicated the simple answer. He pointed to the guards, then to himself, then to the people beyond the gates. He wasn't just asking for a royal visit. He was proposing something much more significant. "You want us to serve them," Thomas said suddenly, understanding dawning in his voice. "Not just protect you from them, but actually help them with their daily struggles." Alexander's enthusiastic nod confirmed this interpretation, and he began to gesture more animatedly. He mimicked carrying heavy loads, helping children, building structures, sharing meals. His vision was of guards who were protectors in the truest sense, people who made life better for everyone in the kingdom. Sergeant Davies, who had been skeptical of the whole proceeding, stepped forward. "But Your Highness, with respect, we're trained for combat and ceremony, not ordinary work." Alexander looked at Davies with those penetrating blue eyes and smiled gently. Then he pointed to the sergeant's strong arms, mimicked the precise movements Davies had been drilling that morning, and gestured toward an elderly woman struggling with a heavy cart just visible through the gates. The message was clear. The same strength and precision that made them excellent guards could make them excellent helpers. The prince then did something that touched every heart present. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, well-worn book. It was a collection of stories about knights and heroes that his mother, the late Queen Margaret, had read to him when he was very small. Alexander opened the book to a particular page and showed it to Captain Thornfield. The captain read aloud the passage Alexander was indicating. "The greatest knights were not those who won the most battles, but those who made life better for the people they were sworn to protect. True honor comes not from standing guard over treasure, but from being a treasure to those who need help." Alexander closed the book and looked at each guard meaningfully. His message was clear. This was the kind of service he wanted them to embrace, not the distant ceremonial protection they had always provided, but active, engaged assistance that would make a real difference in people's lives. The guards exchanged glances, each processing this revolutionary idea. They had joined the Royal Guard for honor, for the prestige of serving the crown directly, for the security and status it provided. But Alexander was asking them to consider a different kind of honor altogether. Young Thomas spoke up again, his voice stronger now. "Captain, what if we tried it? Just for today. We could help in the village and see what happens." Several other guards murmured agreement, caught up in the prince's infectious vision of service. But Captain Thornfield faced a dilemma. Taking the Royal Guard into the village to perform manual labor was completely outside their duties. If something went wrong, if the king disapproved, if it set a precedent that couldn't be maintained, the consequences could be severe. Alexander seemed to sense the captain's internal struggle. The prince approached him and gently took the older man's hand. He looked directly into Thornfield's eyes with an expression that conveyed both understanding and hope. Without words, he was asking the captain to trust him, to believe in this new vision of service. The moment stretched out, filled with possibility and uncertainty. The guards watched their captain wrestle with a decision that could change everything about how they understood their role in the kingdom. The prince waited patiently, never pressuring, but radiating a quiet confidence that his idea was right. Finally, Captain Thornfield made his choice. He turned to his men and spoke in a voice that carried both authority and excitement. "Guards, we serve the royal family. Prince Alexander has made his wishes known. Today, we serve by helping his people." The cheer that went up from the guards surprised everyone, including themselves. They had discovered something they didn't know they wanted, the chance to be heroes in a completely new way. As the gates were opened and they began walking down the hill toward the village, each guard felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Alexander walked among them, his face glowing with happiness. For the first time in his young life, he was leading not through inherited authority, but through inspiration and example. He had shown them a different way to think about service, and they had chosen to follow. But as they approached the village square, none of them could predict how dramatically this simple act of service would transform not just their own understanding of duty, but the entire relationship between the royal family and their subjects. The real test of Alexander's gentle leadership was about to begin. The village of Valdaria had never seen anything like the procession that descended from the palace that morning. Prince Alexander walked at the front, followed by the entire royal guard still wearing their ceremonial armor, creating a sight that drew curious stares from every direction. Merchants paused in their sales, children stopped their games, and workers set down their tools to watch this unprecedented arrival. Alexander surveyed the village square with keen eyes, immediately identifying opportunities for service. An elderly baker struggled to move heavy flour sacks from a delivery cart. A mother with 3 small children tried to manage an overloaded market basket while keeping her youngest from wandering into the busy street. A group of craftsmen worked to repair a community well that had partially collapsed, clearly needing more hands than they had available. Without hesitation, the prince walked directly to the elderly baker and began helping with the flour sacks. His actions broke whatever spell of formality had kept the guards frozen in uncertainty. Thomas Whitmore immediately joined Alexander at the cart, using his blacksmith's strength to easily lift the heavy sacks. Within moments, the entire guard unit had dispersed throughout the square, seeking ways to help. Captain Thornfield found himself assisting the well repair project, his strategic mind quickly assessing the engineering challenges involved. Sergeant Davies, despite his earlier skepticism, was soon helping the overwhelmed mother, entertaining her children with military stories while she completed her shopping. The transformation was remarkable. These soldiers, trained for ceremony and combat, were discovering talents they never knew they possessed. The villagers' initial shock gave way to wonder, and then to genuine warmth. Old Martha, the baker, patted Alexander's arm and tried to offer him payment for his help. The prince smiled and shook his head, then gestured to indicate that helping her was payment enough. She studied his face for a moment, then suddenly understood who he was. Her gasp of recognition spread through the nearby crowd like ripples in a pond. "The prince," she whispered. "The prince is helping us." But instead of the formal bowing and nervous distance that usually accompanied royal visits, something different happened. The villagers saw that Alexander wanted no special treatment, no ceremony or formality. He was there simply to help, and they began to treat him like any other helpful neighbor. As the morning progressed, the barriers between royalty, guards, and commoners continued to dissolve. Alexander worked alongside Thomas to help repair a merchant's broken cartwheel, their communication wordless but perfectly coordinated. The prince would point to what needed to be done, Thomas would nod and act, and together they accomplished tasks that would have been difficult for either one alone. Captain Thornfield noticed that something profound was happening to his men. Guards who had seemed stiff and distant in their formal duties were laughing, joking, and forming genuine friendships with the villagers. They were discovering that their skills, their strength, precision, organization, and training made them incredibly valuable helpers in everyday tasks. More importantly, they were learning about the people they had always protected from a distance. Sergeant Davies discovered that the young mother he was helping was actually a widow whose husband had died serving in the kingdom's outer defenses. Thomas met craftsmen whose skills rivaled anything he had seen in the royal workshops. Every guard found their assumptions about common people challenged and replaced with respect and admiration. Alexander moved through the village like a gentle force of nature, identifying needs and quietly organizing responses. When he noticed a group of elderly villagers struggling to maintain their small gardens, he gestured for several guards to help with the heavy digging and planting. When children gathered curiously around the unusual sight of armored men doing ordinary work, Alexander encouraged the guards to share stories and teach the children simple exercises that improved both strength and discipline. But the most significant moment came when Alexander noticed a commotion near the village courthouse. A family was being evicted from their small home because they couldn't pay increased taxes imposed by a distant royal administrator. The scene was heartbreaking. Children crying, parents trying to remain dignified while losing everything, neighbors wanting to help but lacking the means. Alexander studied the situation carefully, then made a decision that would echo through the kingdom's history. He walked to the courthouse and, in his unique silent way, began to communicate with the royal administrator who was overseeing the eviction. The administrator, recognizing the prince, immediately became obsequious and formal. But Alexander was having none of it. Through gestures, expressions, and the quiet intensity that had become his signature, the prince made it clear that this eviction was to stop immediately. More than that, he indicated that the tax burden needed to be reassessed fairly. When the administrator tried to explain the legal requirements and proper procedures, Alexander simply pointed to the crying children, then to his own royal insignia, then back to the family. His meaning was unmistakable. His authority as future king was being used to protect these people, and that took precedence over administrative convenience. Captain Thornfield watched this interaction with growing amazement. The prince was not just helping with physical tasks. He was actively using his position to address injustice and protect the vulnerable. This was leadership of the highest order, expressed without a single spoken word. As the day continued, news of the prince's activities spread throughout the village and beyond. People began arriving from neighboring communities not as subjects seeking audience with royalty, but as neighbors wanting to meet the young prince who had chosen to serve rather than be served. By afternoon, the entire character of the village square had changed. What had started as a normal market day had become an impromptu festival of cooperation and community. Guards and villagers worked side by side on projects that benefited everyone. Children played games that mixed royal traditions with village customs. Merchants offered their best goods not for profit, but as gifts to people who had spent their day helping others. Alexander stood in the center of it all, his face radiant with joy. This was what he had dreamed of, a kingdom where the distance between ruler and subjects disappeared, where service flowed in all directions, where his inability to speak conventionally was irrelevant because his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. As evening approached and the time came to return to the palace, the guards gathered around their prince. But something had fundamentally changed in their relationship. They no longer saw themselves merely as his protectors. They had become his partners in a new vision of service. Captain Thornfield stepped forward to address the group, but before he could speak, Alexander raised his hand. The prince looked at each guard, then gestured toward the palace on the hill, then back toward the village. His question was clear. Did they want to return to the old way of service, or embrace this new approach? The answer came not from the captain, but from young Thomas Whitmore, whose confidence had grown throughout the day. "Your Highness," he said, "we've discovered something today. We've learned that protecting people doesn't mean standing apart from them. It means standing with them." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the guards. Sergeant Davies, who had begun the day skeptical, stepped forward. "Captain, I've served in the Royal Guard for 15 years, and I've never felt more useful than I did today." Captain Thornfield looked at his men, then at the prince, then at the villagers who had gathered to say goodbye. A decision crystallized in his mind, not just for himself, but for all of them. "Prince Alexander," he said formally, "the Royal Guard respectfully requests permission to redefine our service to the Crown." Alexander tilted his head questioningly. "We wish to step down from purely ceremonial duties," Thornfield continued, "and step up to community service. We want to be guards who protect by helping, soldiers who serve by building, defenders who strengthen the kingdom one person at a time." The prince's smile could have lit the entire village. He reached out and clasped the captain's hand, then each guard's hand in turn. His touch conveyed not just acceptance, but gratitude and pride. As they walked back toward the palace in the gathering dusk, the guards were no longer the same men who had descended that morning. They had discovered that true honor came not from maintaining distance and formality, but from closing gaps and building connections. They had learned that a prince who spoke without words could teach them to serve in ways they had never imagined. Behind them, the villagers watched until the last figure disappeared over the hill. But they knew this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new relationship between palace and people, ruler and subjects, service and power. Prince Alexander had shown them all that the greatest leaders don't just command others to follow. They inspire others to become the best versions of themselves. And sometimes, the most profound messages are delivered not through grand speeches or royal proclamations, but through the quiet choice to help wherever help is needed. The gentle choice that led the Royal Guard to step down from their pedestals and step up to their true calling would be remembered long after the last guard had retired, long after Prince Alexander had become King Alexander, and long after the kingdom of Valderia had become known throughout the land not for its military might or royal ceremony, but for its culture of service, compassion, and community. In the end, the prince who spoke without words had taught an entire kingdom to listen with their hearts.